Okay, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. And really, thanks to all. And of course, our guest, Adam Kirsch, for joining us at this now virtual discussion, of course, due to the weather and the aftermath of the weekend snowstorm. Also, very, very grateful to Sammy Feldbaum from our team for putting all of this together really at the last minute. My name is Jonathan Lincoln. I'm the director at the Center for Jewish Civilization at Georgetown, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our first event of the spring semester. We are really delighted and honored to have such a distinguished and accomplished guest with us today. Adam is well known to many of you, but for those who don't know him, he's currently senior editor at The Atlantic magazine, was previously for many years features editor at the Wall Street Journal. He is a poet, literary critic, and author of several books, including The Blessing and the Curse, Jewish People and Their Books in the 20th Century. And he recently published an excellent and rather thought-provoking review in the New York Review of Books February edition of a New English translation rather of a novel from 1951, chronicling three generations of German Jews and how we should understand it through our current reality. So today we asked Adam to join us to speak about another recent book on settler colonialism, ideology, violence, and justice, published in August of 2024 and what the concept means for the US, Israel, and beyond. I'll ask Adam to speak for around 25, 30 minutes on this topic, and then we'll have a quick conversation and then open it up to the audience, please. I believe that you can send your questions through the chat function or the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And we will do our best to get through as many of the questions as possible in the time. We're going to try and keep this to about an hour and end at around 4 o'clock. So thank you very much, Adam, and welcome. Sorry it's not in person, but over to you.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan. And thanks everyone for tuning in. I'm sorry I wasn't able to be there in person, but technology has overcome nature in this case, so we can still get together and talk virtually. So as Jonathan said, in 2024, I wrote a short book called On Settler Colonialism, which was something that I started thinking about and working on shortly after the Hamas attack on October 7th, 2023. And then over the time since then, it's been almost a year and a half since the book came out. I've also continued to write about Zionism and how the debate over what's going on in Israel has changed the way that people outside of Israel, especially in the United States, talk and think about Zionism, which is closely connected with this idea of settler colonialism. So I thought that today I would just talk a bit about both of these subjects and give a sense of what I've been thinking about, and then we can get into a conversation about it. So I thought I would start in a sort of unusual, maybe unexpected place. Which is with the Academy Awards. I don't know if you are movie buffs, but if you followed the Academy Award nominations, there's a young actress who is nominated for Best Supporting Actress named Odessa Azion, which she spells A'Zion, and that's a stage name. She's taken from her middle name. Zion is her middle name. She's a Jewish actress, American. And when she started using that as her stage name, maybe 5 or 10 years ago, it didn't attract much comment. But now that the word Zionism has become so radioactive, I think to a large part of American public, especially young people, which is the demographic of this 25-year-old actress, there's been this remarkable phenomenon of her getting a ton of online abuse for having this name, for having Zion in her name. And last month, in order to sort of diffuse some of this hostility, she posted on social media saying, like, I just want to make clear that I'm not a Zio. And some of you may know that Zio is a term that was a sort of white supremacist, anti-Semitic insult that was coined by David Duke in the 1990s, and until recently was something that you would hear only in white supremacist hate groups. Zio is sort of a sort of a way of saying Jew or Jewish Zionist. And so here we're in a situation in 2026 where, in order to sort of maintain appeal to the public, a Jewish person with Zion in their name is using the word Zio to say, I'm not a Zionist. In other words, the word Zio is less offensive to her than the term Zionist is. And I think it's a remarkable transformation of public discourse and understanding of Zionism as a term, as an idea, and what it stands for as an and political movement, as an aspiration for the Jewish people. Um, this is connected, obviously, with what has been going on in Israel and Gaza since October 7th, 2023. I think that before that, you might have had this degree of hostility towards Zionism on the left, maybe on the more extreme parts of the left, and certainly in the academic world, I think it was very common. But after October 7th and after the war in Gaza, it's become very mainstream. And I think that among young people and on social media, especially, the term Zionist is basically an all-purpose insult. And if you have the intestinal fortitude to go on social media and just sort of search for the term Zionist, say on X, and see how it comes up and how it's used, you'll see that it's used in uh, almost exactly the same way that the word Jew used to be used in the most virulent kind of anti-Semitic rhetoric. People feel totally comfortable saying things like Zionists are baby killers, Zionists like to torture children, all kinds, any kind of horrible crime that you might ascribe to in the Middle Ages to a Jew as a blood libel. Now you can ascribe to a Zionist, and it's completely normalized in a lot of those spaces. So so one question is, how did this happen? Why has this been the reaction to what's happened in Israel and Gaza since October 7th, 2023? Well, one reason, obviously, and I think sort of the foundational reason is indignation at the terrible suffering of Palestinians in Gaza. I mean, that is the driver of all this. It is the war in Gaza, the killing and displacement of tens of thousands, millions of people. And that has sort of driven anti-Israel sentiment around the world, especially in Europe, but also in the United States. And then the way that, especially in American politics, Israel has become entangled with all kinds of other partisan issues, the way that, for example, anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism on university campuses became a signature issue for the Trump administration, made it implicated with American partisan politics. So in all of these ways, the term has come to stand for a lot of things, for a lot of allegiances, a lot of identities that progressive young people see as terrible, see as, really evil. And I think that for a lot of people in these circles, the term Zionist is not that distant from the term Nazi. It carries an equivalent moral charge. It means someone who who causes a genocide, right? That the war in Gaza has been sort of normatively described as a genocide, that's taken for granted among a lot of people. Who committed a genocide? It was the Nazis. Therefore, Israel is a Nazi country. Zionists are Nazis. I think that sort of interpretation, or that linkage of ideas, is extremely common among young American progressives today. It's extremely common among campus activists. Um, One way that you can respond to that is to say all the reasons why it's not factually true, right? Why that equation is not factually true, why the war in Gaza is not a genocide. And talk about the very complicated history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, of the state of Israel, the realities of what the war in Gaza was like and has been like. And that's one important conversation, but it's not what I'm going to talk about, and it's not really what I'm sort of expert or qualified in to talk about. What I want to talk about rather is how the idea of Zionism became so readily assimilated to this idea of genocide, of colonialism, of what's often called settler colonialism. Because if you follow this debate at all, if you follow campus politics at all, or if you follow sort of professional progressive politics, activism, you'll definitely know the term settler colonialism. It's very common currency. And one thing that I think is important to remember is that although the war in Gaza has driven a lot of this sentiment, um, I talk about in the book, which I started writing shortly after October 7th, that the very first immediate reaction to October 7th, to the Hamas attack on Israel that killed 1,200 Israelis, mostly civilians, was, in a lot of these circles, complete approval and enthusiasm. And I quote in the book, this is now sort of feels like a distant past, but you might remember that at the time, like on October 8th, October 9th, when this news was first coming to the United States, there was this phenomenon on a lot of American campuses where professors and student groups put out statements sort of welcoming this attack, saying this was a great thing. It caused exhilaration, it caused enthusiasm. These are some of the terms people used. And in this, when people said things like that, they almost always said because it was an attack on settler colonialism, an attack on Israelis, even civilians, was an attack on settler colonialism. Israel is a settler colonial society, therefore it's a valid target for armed resistance. And some people even said there's no such thing as an Israeli civilian. Israelis aren't civilians, they're settlers, because settler is a different category. And I think that that sort of basic interpretation, that basic worldview, set the stage for a lot of the way that the subsequent conflict in Gaza has been understood. Um, if it's a war or a war of defense, self-defense by a country against a terrorist group that killed 1,200 people, and that the country in response wants to root out the terrorist group at the price of very high civilian casualties. That's one way of looking at the war in Gaza. Another way of looking at the war in Gaza is it was a genocide. It was an attempt to exterminate the Palestinians in Gaza, and that is really sort of a continuation of what has always been the Zionist project of trying to exterminate Palestinian Arabs. And I think that that is the way that Zionism is understood and the war in Gaza is understood by a lot of people, a lot of Americans, especially young people. And the reason why that interpretation came so naturally is that the idea that Zionism is genocidal or that the existence of the state of Israel is a genocide, constitutes a genocide, is something that has been elaborated on theoretically by political activists, by political theorists, by Middle Eastern studies people for a very long time. And in fact, if you go back to earlier rounds of conflict between Israel and Hamas, because this most recent one was by far the deadliest, but it's not the first. There have been similar armed conflicts between Hamas and Israel really every 5 or 6 years since Hamas took power in the Gaza Strip. Um, After those conflicts, in which a much smaller number of people died, maybe talking about 1,000 people, which is still, of course, a huge and a horrendous number of deaths, but compared to what's happened in Gaza over the last 2 years, is a much smaller number. Each of those conflicts was also described as a genocide at the time by parts of the left, by some world leaders, by Palestinian leaders and pro-Palestinian activists in the United States. The idea that um, what's happening, the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, between Jews and Arabs, is genocidal, is sort of baked into the way a lot of people understand the entire Middle East. And at the bottom of that is this idea of settler colonialism. So, what do people mean when they talk about settler colonialism? In the book, which as I said, is a short book and written, on a brief time scale. So it's not a scholarly book and it's not an in-depth history. It's more of a sort of critical introduction. I talk about how the idea of the term settler colonialism originated and how it has been transformed over the years. So the term settler colonialism comes out of the era of decolonization after World War II in the 1950s and 60s, when the big European empires, the British and French empires, and some smaller ones, were being broken up, partly or sort of mainly because the imperial powers no longer had the resources or the political will to maintain those empires. And so after World War II, you saw a huge movement of decolonization in Asia and Africa, where territories that had been ruled by Britain and France gained independence. Sometimes that happened after the imperial power simply withdrew, which is what happened with Britain in India and also in Israel and Palestine. Sometimes it happened after a fierce armed resistance by peoples against foreign rule, which is what happened in Vietnam and in Algeria against the French Empire, both of which were very bloody wars that lasted a long time and ended in national independence. Um, as that was going on, the term settler colonialism sort of emerged as a category to distinguish different one particular form that European colonialism took, and it was the form that colonialism took classically in Algeria or in Rhodesia. And what happened in those places, or in South Africa, what happened in those places is that a European imperial power encouraged settlement of its people in a colony, so that by the time Algeria began to struggle for independence in the 1950s, really struggle started earlier in the 1940s, but by the time that open war started in the 1950s, about 15% of the population of Algeria was European, and 85% was native, Arab and Berber. Or in Rhodesia, about 8 to 10% of the population were white Europeans and 90% were Africans. So in those countries, you had a very distinctive settler class, a class of people who had come to the place to settle, sometimes a very long time earlier. In France, that process started in the 1830s. So by the time of the independence struggle, those people had lived in Algeria, some of them for over a century. But it was very easy to distinguish the settler class from the native population, which was a vast majority. And the struggle for decolonization sort of directly and necessarily involved disestablishing and maybe expelling the settlers. Because when you have a situation where 10% of the people have all the political power and all the resources and all of the wealth, and traditionally sort of ruled the 90% with an iron fist, the struggle for national independence means getting rid of that 10%. And in fact, what happened in Algeria is that as soon as Algeria won its independence and France sort of agreed, we're not going to consider Algeria French anymore, almost the entire European population left. They immediately left and went to France, crossed the Mediterranean. So that's what sort of what settler colonialism looked like when the term was coined. But in the 1990s and 2000s, the term began to take on a new meaning in the work of academic theorists who came out of the world of sociology and anthropology. So these are people who are not primarily historians or area studies people, but sociologists and anthropologists. And I say in the book that maybe the best way of understanding the idea of settler colonialism is as a critical theory. So critical theory is a theory of sort of an adversarial theory of why is society the way it is? Why does it have the injustices it does? What are the ways that it needs to be corrected? And there have been different kinds of critical theory. The term originally refers to a sort of Marxist critical theory. There's also been critical race theory, which talks about the influence of racism and slavery, particularly in American society. And in the 1990s and 2000s, settler colonial studies emerged as another kind of critical theory. And what it basically said is we shouldn't just consider countries like Algeria or Rhodesia or South Africa to be settler colonial societies. We should consider Australia, the United States, and Canada to be settler colonial societies. That the best way to understand these countries, including the one that we live in, is as a settler colonial society, meaning that the process of colonization that began in the 17th or 18th century shouldn't be seen as something that happened in the past and is now over and done with. It should be seen as an ongoing and sort of, in fact, inherently never-ending process. So you couldn't say that settlement or colonization is a past phase of American history. The way we usually talk about colonial America, we mean before the American Revolution. Rather, colonial is the way that America sort of always is and always will be because it rests on the expulsion and expropriation of the original indigenous population. And if, as in other colonial situations like Algeria, that kind of dispossession and expropriation can never be truly valid. It's always a crime. It's always a wrong that has to be reversed. Then that's also true in some place like Australia or the United States or Canada, where not 10%, but something more like 98% of the population is not indigenous. So if you think about what does it mean to say that the United States, we can focus on the United States because that's where we are and what we're familiar with, although there's a lot of literature about this in Australia and Canada as well. What does it mean to think of the United States as a settler colonial society that should be decolonized? If the goal of studying studying settler colonialism is to combat it, and this is definitely an activist scholarship. It's a scholarship that will say, not in a covert way, but right up in front, the goal of studying settler colonialism is to dismantle it. What does it mean to decolonize or to dismantle a colonial society where there's no concrete possibility of getting rid of the settlers? Because in the United States, that's obviously um, sort of the status quo is only 1 or 2% of the population of the United States can trace its ancestry to people who were here before settlement began, before the English began conquest in the early 17th century. Well, so one thing it means is that we're not just talking about settler as the historical act of particular individuals. A settlement is not just what happened starting in the 1600s in Virginia and New England, right? That's when we ordinarily, in ordinary scholarship, in ordinary historiography, when you talk about British settlement of North America, that's what you're talking about. You're talking about the Puritans, the Virginia colonists. It's not just those people, and it's also not just the descendants of those people, because at this point in time, the majority population of the United States is not descended from settlers. It's not descended from colonizers, that is, people who were here before 1776. It's descended from people who came to an already existing country called the United States of America, and see themselves and have always been referred to as immigrants, immigrants to an already existing country. Well, one of the sort of points of theory that's also a point of almost etiquette in settler colonial studies is that there's no such thing as an immigrant. Because if you're an immigrant, it implies that you're coming to a legitimate established country to join it. It's better in the eyes of this sort of theoretical view to think of everyone as a settler, even people who came to the United States after independence, even people who come to the United States today. Because if there are only two identity categories, settler and indigenous, then everyone who's not indigenous is a settler. And one of the sort of interesting corollaries of this, the theoretical debate in this field is, are African Americans settlers? In other words, if your ancestors came here because they were brought here by force as slaves, does that make you a settler? And there's a sort of two ways of looking at this, but a lot of people in settler colonial studies say yes. African Americans are effectively settlers also because they are non-indigenous people who are now on indigenous land. And when you think about it that way, you realize what a radical reinterpretation of American history it is to think of this as a settler colonial society. One thing it does is it sort of puts an end to this sort of classic idea of multiculturalism, the idea that America is a society made up of a plurality of cultures, and that pluralism is sort of a strength of American society because we have many different groups from many different backgrounds, and they can all come together in America in a system that, at least theoretically or hopefully, guarantees individual liberty and equality and create this new kind of country that's never existed anywhere else. And that was the sort of understanding of American history that was advanced by the civil rights movement. And I talk a little bit in the book about the way that Martin Luther King saw the civil rights movement as a counterpart or as an extension of decolonization. His activity was happening right in the classic period of decolonization. He was very interested in and involved in African decolonization. In fact, was at the independence movement for some countries after they decolonized. But the way that we're sort of used to thinking about civil rights in the United States is through this idea of a more perfect union, the idea that the work of the American founding was left incomplete. This was sort of the central idea that King advanced, and that in a sort of very effective way, had the American establishment adopt as the sort of mainstream establishment view of American history since the civil rights era has been, the work of the founding was not complete. And this is something that you can see if you look at the speeches of both Republican and Democratic presidents since then. And that to complete it, what we're working towards is a future equality, an equality that was established, promised in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, but never actually delivered, never actually manifested. That's a sort of ultimately hopeful way of thinking about American history and the American future. Although you can say that it's also, not urgent enough or not activist enough, that it doesn't actually bring us closer to the day that King is hoping for. It's a way of thinking about American history that says the founding of America is at least potentially a good thing and can be vindicated as a good thing. If you think about America as a settler colony, then the only way to tell the American story is as an original genocide, the genocide of Native Americans, and everyone who's here now is a beneficiary of that genocide. And in a way, not just a beneficiary of the genocide, but a continuer of the genocide, an accomplice of the genocide. One of the most famous lines, maybe the most famous sentence in settler colonial theory, and it's something that's quoted often in this academic literature, is by an Australian anthropologist named Patrick Wolfe, who wrote in the 1990s and 2000s. He's now deceased, but he wrote a very influential book about settler colonialism in Australia. And he said in this book, settler, settler colonialism, colonization is a process, not an event. Meaning it's not something that happened in the past and is now over. It is the ongoing process of colonization. As long as the settler society continues to exist, the process of colonization is continuing. So in that framework, a settler colonial society is both a beneficiary of genocide, of the elimination of the original population, and sort of a perpetuator of genocide. And that idea that America, Australia, or Canada are at their core genocidal enterprises, genocidal countries, is, I think, very deeply rooted in the idea of settler colonialism, and through that field of study has become very popular, or at least well known among younger educated Americans. So if you were to look at a college course catalog, I'm not sure how much this has changed in the last year. Maybe it has changed a bit in the last year, but certainly over the last 10 years, you would see that the idea of settler colonialism, the term settler colonialism, comes up in courses all on many different disciplines, surprisingly disparate areas. You could see settler colonialism in a course on public health, on American history, on feminism, on gender studies. All different things can be understood through the lens of settler colonialism, because essentially it's a way of diagnosing or explaining everything that could conceivably be wrong about a society, is to trace it back to this original sin of colonization, of genocide. And I say in the book that settler colonialism is really a political theory of original sin. It says that countries that began as settler colonial enterprises are permanently tainted by that, and not just in a sort of metaphorical or metaphysical sense, but in concrete ways. Things that are wrong about American society can be traced back to, understood as manifestations of settler colonialism. So I've been talking about America, and that's a lot of what the book is about. How does that connect to Israel? Well, I think that the key move is this. People in Australia, in America, in Canada, who embrace an identity as opponents of settler colonialism or of advocates of decolonization, they can work towards that in various ways, through political activism, through teaching, through writing. But as I said, it's very hard to imagine the concrete decolonization or disestablishment of any of those countries. But in Israel, it's not hard to imagine that. And in fact, ever since the state of Israel was established, there have been people actively working to disestablish it. So if Israel is also a settler colonial society, um, and I'll talk in a minute about the ways in which it does and doesn't fit that paradigm, then an attack on the state of Israel is a concrete military physical attack on settler colonialism. And in fact, that's exactly how the Hamas attack of October 7th was described by people who welcomed it, as a blow against settler colonialism. And if you believe that settler colonialism is, in fact, at the bottom of most of what's wrong with the modern world, and there are very wide-ranging ramifications. People write that settler colonialism is responsible for environmental crisis, for example. It's responsible for economic inequality. It's responsible for gender inequality. It's responsible for homophobia and transphobia. All of these are things that can be traced back to settler colonialism. Then settler colonialism is the dragon that has to be slain in order to achieve a better world. In that way, it's similar to what capitalism was for a communist worldview. And so anyone who's fighting against settler colonialism is sort of ipso facto on the side of progress, on the side of good, on the side of liberation. And so that, I think, is how you get to the strange point that we got to over the last few years, where American progressives, people who saw themselves as very progressive and upheld progressive values, began to say that Hamas or Hezbollah were their allies, that they championed those causes, that they waved Hamas and Hezbollah flags at demonstrations, and that they saw the slaughter of 1,200 people, of 1,200 Israelis in their beds, as an act of liberation, of emancipation, a sort of just, virtuous thing to do because it was this great blow against settler colonialism. If settler colonialism is the primary evil, then opposing settler colonialism is always right. And that, I think, is the connection between the sort of hostility to settler colonialism in theory and the hostility to Zionism and the state of Israel in practice. Because I think that for a lot of people who define themselves as anti-Zionist, both people who are really very engaged in this body of theory and thought, and then the much larger group of people who are not really engaged in it, but receive it at secondhand because they studied it in a class as an undergraduate or because they hear about it. Um, Zionism is sort of the one living example of settler colonialism that you can concretely combat and imagine winning against and making it disappear. And the form that that would take is disestablishing the state of Israel as a Jewish state. So maybe that is a good place for me to stop. I've been talking for a little bit, and then Jonathan, you and I can go from there and talk a little bit.
Thank you so much, Adam. That was a really an incredibly rich and broad overview of all of this. I think we've all learned a tremendous amount. Just to say, I see a couple of questions already, and I see a couple of hands raised. The way that this, just to remind everybody, the way that this webinar is going to work is that you send the questions to the Q&A function. So if you can't find that, that's at the bottom of your screen. If your screen is sort of too small, you don't see Q&A, push more, and hopefully Q&A should pop up, and that will send the questions. And again, as I said earlier, I'll do my best to try and go through all of them. I do have a couple myself, though. I have actually quite a few. It's sort of hard to know where to start, but one thing, and having read quite a bit of your work, Adam, and followed this debate, and obviously being present on a college campus, of course, we talk about decolonization of fields of study and everything like that. My own background, of course, is from the practice, and having worked and lived in societies in conflict, a number of which, including in Israel and Palestine and other places, of course, would qualify, I suppose, from the settler colonial branding. But from your understanding of this, how does this resonate on the ground? In other words, and maybe particularly inside Israel and Palestine. I mean, does this discourse resonate, or is this a very typically American type of discourse? And is it really intended to just help us as Americans potentially try and better understand the reality or not, as the case may be, on the ground? So I'll ask that first. Thanks.
Okay, well, I mean, first of all, I'd say I'm not particularly an expert on current political trends in either Israel or Palestine, and the people who I talk to and who are my interlocutors are almost all Jewish Israelis and not Palestinians, just due to the kinds of places that I'm invited to talk and the kinds of spaces that I'm in. So my impressions of this are partly from talking to Jewish Israelis and partly from reading the way that this is discussed in some Palestinian and Israeli media. My impression is that the shift towards thinking of the Arab-Israeli conflict as a settler colonial conflict, in other words, as an anti-colonial movement, is something that has been sort of actively embraced by Palestinian activists, especially outside of the area, but also in Palestine, sort of consciously and deliberately embraced over the last decade as a very powerful way of framing the conflict that generates more solidarity and more sympathy than earlier ways of framing the conflict. So one way that you can see this, and a sort of important turning point in all this discourse, was the Standing Rock protests in, I believe, 2015. Some of you may remember that there was a lot of international attention was paid to the digging of an oil pipeline underneath a Sioux reservation in North Dakota that was going to take oil from Canada to the United States. And the Standing Rock Sioux, which is a group of about 8,000 people, did not want the pipeline dug underneath their land. and sort of actively resisted it. There was a confrontation. People faced down construction equipment, and it became an international sort of focal point for progressive activism in much the same way that Occupy Wall Street had been a few years earlier. One of the interesting things that happened there was that Standing Rock immediately became framed as a similar conflict to Gaza. And so there were a lot of signs at the time and slogans that said from Standing Rock to Gaza. There were Palestinian organizations that sent deputations to Standing Rock. And that was a good example of what does it mean to frame the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a settler colonial conflict. It means saying that Israeli Jews are in the same position in Israel as non-Indigenous Americans are in North America. That just as the US government sort of fundamentally has no right to tell the Sioux what to do with their land because there is no legitimate sovereignty over Sioux territory. So in the same way, Israel has no real legitimate sovereignty over its territory. And so the struggle to sort of disestablish Israel as a Jewish state is a struggle against a colonial power, a non-indigenous people that has come and taken an indigenous land that doesn't belong to it. So it was a remarkable equivalence because these are obviously very different kinds of conflicts, both in terms of history, in terms of the forces arrayed on either side, and also in terms of the way that they're fought out. Standing Rock was a nonviolent. There were elements of confrontation, but it was a nonviolent protest versus the sort of Israel-Hamas wars, which are extremely violent and extremely bloody. I think that for activists, for advocates of the Palestinian cause, to see that cause in terms of settler colonialism and to identify it with indigenous rights movements has been a very successful reframing of the debate. I think that it's really contributed to the much greater support for Palestinian rights for the Palestinian cause among younger Americans. It's one of the things that has reframed that debate for younger Americans. Because if you look at polling data by age cohort, you can see that, especially since October 7th, but even before that, traditionally, Israel, in polls of American public opinion, people would say about 80% sympathize with Israel. If you look at people under 30, it's about 80% sympathize with Palestinians. And I think that that has a lot to do with it. How is this idea received in Israel? My impression is that it's not nearly as current in Israel. It's not nearly as much part of the discourse because fundamentally what it asks is the argument it puts forward is to disestablish the state of Israel, to say that the state of Israel should not exist, should never have existed, that it cannot validly exist. And I think that that argument is so far from the reality of what Israeli Jews, how they live, what their goals are, that it simply doesn't speak to them, and in fact isn't designed to speak to them. So outside of a few very left-wing, anti-Zionist, post-Zionist spaces, maybe in Israeli academia, I don't think that it has any traction at all, really.
No, thank you so much for that. Really useful. Okay, we have a bunch of questions in the Q&A, and so I'll go through them. And forgive me if I try to editorialize a little bit, just for brevity. But we have questions related to this the framework of settler colonialism and how it helps explains the power dynamics shaping Lebanon's current humanitarian crisis. And in particular, we're talking about the displacement patterns, Syrian refugees, internal displacement in the south, as connected to broader colonial legacies in the region. And then finally, it's one big question, but what misconceptions about the Middle East does settler colonialism debate help clarify or risk reinforcing? Um, I'll start with that. Thanks.
Sure. Well, the I won't focus on Lebanon. I'll focus on the issue on the question of Zionism and how Zionism is and isn't related to settler colonialism. Um, Obviously, the entire map of the modern Middle East is in large part a legacy of British and French imperialism, right? The borders of a lot of I think most of the countries in the Middle East were drawn by British and French diplomats during and after World War I. That's certainly true of what's now Israel. It's true of of Jordan, of Saudi Arabia, of Syria, Iraq. All of those countries were essentially created by the British and originally as client states after World War I. So the idea that the Middle East sort of bears the legacy of imperialism and French imperialism in Syria and Lebanon is indisputable. It's obvious. It's a part of the historical record. In the same way as I would say the idea that the history of Australia and the United States and Canada is the history of British imperialism is also obvious and undisputed. And in fact, it's sort of the most basic thing you could say about any of these places. Um, and I don't think any sane person would dispute that. What matters more, I think, is what what are the critical implications of the idea of settler colonialism for analyzing those places now and going forward. So one implication of it is that it rewrites or it writes a narrative of Zionism that is very different from the way that Zionists themselves understand it and has historically understood what Zionism was about. Um, the sort of anti-Zionist view of Zionism, of the history of Zionism, is that it is a white European settlement movement analogous to the ones that took place in Australia, in North America, in South Africa, that brought white Europeans to a place where they sort of weren't from and didn't belong, and expropriated an indigenous people. Took land from an indigenous people and sort of built a state structure on top of it. That's very different from the way that Zionism in particular has always thought of its own history, because the self-understanding of Zionism is that Jews are an indigenous people. Jews are the indigenous people of the land of Israel. And in fact, the idea of Zionism, sort of from the beginning of its modern formulation in the 1880s, is that far from being an imperial sort of conquest of foreign territory, it was a return of an indigenous people to the territory that it had been dispossessed from by an empire, by the Roman Empire originally, a very long time ago, 2,000 years ago. And so one thing I say in the book is that if you could imagine some concrete decolonization of the United States, if you could imagine, for example, that the United States were to say, we're going to take Arizona and make it an indigenous homeland, and all indigenous peoples from across North America can go there and create their own society, revive their own language and culture, have sovereignty over their own borders. That would essentially look like what Zionism looked like, as a movement of an expelled people to a country that they had lost. So I think on that very basic level, seeing Zionism as a settler colonial movement misses one of the most important internal dynamics of Zionism. Then the other thing, and I think maybe the more consequential thing, and one of the reasons why I wrote the book, is that if you frame the sort of the conflict between Jews and Arabs, between Israelis and Palestinians, as a settler colonial conflict, an anti-colonial conflict, it sort of precludes any peaceful settlement of the conflict, because it says the Jews are sort of a foreign imposition who are here at the point of a gun, should never have been here, don't have any real reason to be here, any connection with the land, and that no matter how long the state of Israel sustains itself, just as you know, North America, English civilization in North America is now more than 400 years old, but is still a settler colonial society, still a settlement, and the people who participate in it are still settlers. So it doesn't matter that the first sort of Jewish settlements, modern Jewish settlements, took place in the 1870s, 1880s. It doesn't matter that we're almost 150 years after that. Jews in the state of Israel and the land of Israel are settlers. And as long as they're there, they're going to remain settlers. So that casts the conflict in zero-sum terms. It means there cannot be a settlement of what up until, maybe the 1990s or 2000s was the liberal position, which was two states for two peoples. That's not a just settlement, because it leaves in place a Jewish settler colonial state. And I think that that's one of the reasons why you had people celebrating the murder of Israeli civilians back on October 7th. It's that if the goal is not a peaceful settlement or a just settlement, but the dismantling of an illegitimate Jewish state, of a settler colonial state, then doing that by force is sort of force in a virtuous cause. It casts the conflict as a permanent war, basically a war to the death. And that framing of it, I think, is guaranteed to increase and sort of exaggerate and accentuate conflict rather than reduce conflict. So I do think that ultimately the only imaginable peaceful settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is some recognition of the principle that there are two peoples in this land, both of whom have a right to be there, both of whom have historic connection and current existence on this land, and that there is no way to end that state of affairs without truly disastrous violence. So anything sort of the way I would come down in the book is anything that tends to undermine that understanding of the conflict is essentially bad for both parties. So that even activism that sees itself as pro-Palestinian, in theory, in practice, I think has not been pro-Palestinian, has not tended to help people in Gaza. And in fact, what's happened in Gaza over the last 2 years is a very clear example of that.
Thank you. Lot to digest. There are probably not going to get to all of the questions, but I'm going to try and consolidate. I think there were a couple of questions in particular, and this sort of speaks to your last point about settlers, in particular in the West Bank and how this applies. So the question reads, Adam, your book is brilliant and necessary, but couldn't one describe as settler colonialists the settlers who are taking over Palestinian land in the West Bank and driving them out of their homes?
Yes, and in fact, I say in the beginning of the book, the very first chapter, that one of the interesting things about the way settler colonial was used after October 7th and is used now is that to people who are sort of versed in Israeli politics, Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the term settler has a very specific meaning. It means Israeli Jews living in occupied Palestinian territories on the West Bank. Until at a certain point, there were also some Israeli settlements in Gaza. They were dismantled and withdrawn under Ariel Sharon, but they were very small in size. And there's a very large number of Jews who are settled on the West Bank, something at this point, something like 500,000, as opposed to, or compare it to maybe 7 million Israeli Jews living inside the borders of Israel proper. There are about 500,000 Israeli Jews living in the occupied territories. And so until fairly recently, when you talked about Israeli settlers, you were talking about those people. And those people have different motivations, they have different backgrounds, they have different ideas. Some are very religious, some are there for more for economic reasons, and are more secular. And there is and both domestically within Israel and internationally a strong case to be made that those settlements should be dismantled and sort of will have to be dismantled in any sort of serious solution of the conflict. And that continuing to build the settlements is a way of making sure that the conflict can never be solved. So I think that if you're talking about settlement in the West Bank, you're much closer to a situation like the classic settler colonial regimes in Algeria or in Rhodesia, where the government is deployed on behalf of a minority against the majority. And I think that a lot has been written about that. A lot is reported about it. There are a lot of Israeli NGOs that are very vocal about that. Um, and you might say that the failure of the Israelis to put an end to that process or to sort of realistically envision what an end might look like is one of the reasons why the conflict has gotten so much worse, because there is no realistic or sort of plausible endpoint for that process. But I think that if you fail to distinguish between settlers in the West Bank and Israeli citizens in what used to be called Israel proper or behind the Green Line, then you're actually, this is another point I make in the book, you're actually making exactly the same argument as the sort of most ultra-religious settlers in the West Bank, which is that there is no distinction. The entire land, they would say the entire land of Israel is ours, it was promised to us, God wants us to be there, and therefore it's completely artificial to say part of it is Israel and part of it isn't. Alternatively, on the other side, you would say Israel is a settler colonial state, and that's true in Tel Aviv just as much as it is in Hebron, and therefore there's to draw any distinction between them is pointless and artificial. I think that's a very ominous way of looking at the conflict.
So it's almost as if the settlers themselves have adopted a sort of form of settler colonial ideology in looking at this. Sorry for the tongue twister there. Okay, how can we effectively counter the settler colonial arguments that, as you describe, are now preeminent on campuses and in our society?
It's a good question, and it's one that I've been asked a lot and tried to think about a lot over the last 2 years. I'm not an academic, I'm not a professor, and I'm a journalist, and I don't spend most of my time on campuses. So in a way, I'm not well suited to answer that question. I know there are a lot of people thinking about it. One thing that has happened over the last year or so since the beginning of the second Trump administration is that there was a sort of strong attempt to leverage the concept of anti-Semitism to influence the way that Zionism and Israel are talked about. So I think there are indisputably parts of the anti-Israel sort of activist movement and examples of anti-Israel activism on campus that are anti-Semitic, that use anti-Semitic language. As I said at the beginning, go online and see the way people talk about Zionists, and it is sort of nakedly anti-Semitic at a lot of the time. At the same time, I think that to effectively sort of address and engage this, you can't use the framework of anti-Semitism because people who think of themselves as anti-Zionists mostly sort of repudiate the idea that they're anti-Semitic, and in fact, some of them are Jews. A sort of certain percentage of young Jews, maybe even as high as 40%, would say that they are anti-Zionist. And during the sort of big wave of campus activism in 2024, which I know caused a great deal of concern among American Jews, and really a sort of sense of fear in a lot of places. One of the elements of that was, Jewish Voices for Peace holding a liberation Seder on a college campus. It's hard to say that that's anti-Semitic. It's hard to tell those people that what they're doing is anti-Semitic. I think what's much more necessary is to talk about what Zionism actually means, what it has historically meant, what it means to the people who identify as Zionists, in which I include myself, and what it doesn't mean, what it doesn't include, that it does not mean the sort of settler colonialism that people have in mind when they talk about the settlement of Australia. It does not mean racial or ethnic superiority, as I think a lot of people think that it does. And to talk about, what was the history of Zionism? What is the history of Israel? How did those first Zionist settlers get there? What did they think they were doing? Why did the Jewish settlement in Israel take the form that it took? Those are all very complicated and controversial historical questions, but I think that they're worth asking and teaching and even arguing about because of the specificity. I think that the history, as is so often the case, Jews and Jewish history does not fit paradigms that were evolved for other much bigger groups. And so thinking about Israel as a settler colonial project, I think, obscures more than it reveals about Zionism and about the country, why the country has the shape that it does today.
It's a huge topic and something I would love to explore more, perhaps in another conversation, maybe if we get you down to campus finally. But we still have
Yeah.
time for a couple more, so I'll go ahead. In the same way that left-wing anti-Semitism has adopted some right-wing rhetoric or ideas, for example, the blood libel or the word Zio, to what extent have right-wing anti-Semites adopted left-wing ideas like settler colonialism in their discourse?
I don't think that any right-wing Jews use the term settler colonialism. They recognize that it's a term that's directed against them. Or I think most Zionists, most people who would be on that side of this debate, recognize that that's not a term they want associated with them and is pejorative. Essentially, it's a pejorative term. I mean, it's not something you want to be. So I don't think I've encountered anyone saying, yes, this is an example of Jewish settler colonialism, and that's a good thing. The arguments for why Jewish settlement in what's now the state of Israel are a good thing, I think, usually more involve distancing from the term settler colonialism and talking about it in different terms as a response to urgent necessity, existential necessity, as a return of indigenous people to their homeland. And I think maybe to me, the most persuasive of all, looking at it in a more pragmatic sense, is there are 7.5 million Israeli Jews who don't have anywhere else to go except where they are. And one of the things that I say in the book is that if you see Israel as a settler colonial society, then and the sort of the model that you have in mind is decolonization. Decolonization can happen in a place like Algeria because the million Pied Noir, the European settlers in Algeria, there were a million of them, and they could get on boats and go across the Mediterranean to France because French Algeria was legally part of France. So they were going back to the mother country, so to speak. Israel does not have a mother country. And in fact, part of the reason why the history of Zionism is unique is that it was founded by people who were fleeing persecution in Europe, not by people who were being sent out by European empires as colonizers to create an outpost. Um, in fact, if you look at the sort of history of British rule in mandatory Palestine, by the late 1920s and certainly by the 1940s, the Zionist movement was fighting against British imperialism in order to create a Jewish state. So if you think of if you look at it in those terms, it becomes much clearer that Israel is not the result of white European settlement in a sort of non-indigenous territory. It's the origins of its population are very multicultural. They come from many different places, many of them from Arab countries. The population of Israel is not a majority white in terms of just what we in the United States would categorize as white. And all of those things are legacies of the actual story of Zionism and how Israel was created, which is that it was created by waves of emigration fleeing crisis in different parts of the world. In fact, every large wave of settlement of Jews in Israel has been driven by crisis. That's one reason why there's never been large-scale American Jewish settlement in Israel. If that were ever to happen, it would be as a result of crisis in the United States. So there's no place to decolonize Israeli Jews back to, is what it comes down to. And one thing I say in the book is that it would be better to think of Israeli Jews as being in the situation of Algerians fighting against foreign occupation. If you're a people that has nowhere else to go, this is the only place that you have to go, then you fight very ferociously, as the FLN did in Algeria, as the Viet Minh did in Vietnam, because you have nowhere else to go. You could also say that that's why the American colonists won the American Revolution, is because ultimately in an anti-colonial struggle, it's going to be more costly for the colonizers to maintain themselves than it is for the native people, because the colonizers always have the option to leave. The Israeli Jews do not have an option to leave. And so even regardless of what we're thinking about that normatively, just analytically, to understand the conflict, I think it's important to understand that.
Okay, I think we have time for about one more, so I'm going to try and add something here. A little bit, probably we need a little bit more time to unpack, but Israel has for many years taken a Palestinian state off the table. And in 2024, Israel's Knesset made it official by overwhelmingly rejecting a two-state solution. To what extent could Israel deflate the potency of the arguments made by proponents of settler colonialism if it genuinely extended to Palestinians the prospect of sovereignty and self-determination? What has been the impact of the Israeli government adopting its own zero-sum approach to the Israel-Palestine conflict? And then a sort of side note, Jabotinsky, of course, referred to the Zionist project as colonialism, quote unquote, something oft quoted by proponents of settler colonialism.
Yes, and Herzl used the term colony and colonist as well. Um, I touched on this a little bit earlier, that there was a moment in the 1990s when it seemed as though a two-state solution was possible or over the horizon, and it did not eventuate. And the reasons why it did not come to pass are fiercely disputed. If you ever want to get into a really endless and minutely detailed debate, start asking people, why was it that Camp David didn't lead to, or who was responsible in 2000 in the Y Accords. Those are all things that are debated in the sense of which side was to blame for the non-creation of a Palestinian state. At this point, I think that it is not politically feasible for Jews. There's no Jewish majority for the idea of a two-state solution, just as there's no Palestinian majority for it either. In fact, historically, there usually hasn't been. Only at exceptional moments, I think, have polls showed that there's anything like a consensus wanting that to happen. And the reason why is that both sides don't trust each other, don't think that that concession will be met by concession. And I think for Israeli Jews, especially after October 7th, the idea that they would cede territory or cede power or sovereignty to people who had just attempted to kill them is sort of obviously insane. And so I don't think that there's really any political constituency in Israel for that right now. So I do think that for in the near future, I don't see the situation getting better. Probably it's just we've just been through as bad as it can possibly be. Hopefully, will not get worse. But any kind of real peace settlement, I don't think is on the horizon. But I do think that this is such a long-running conflict and one of the world's long-running conflicts where things can happen over time that don't seem possible at a given moment in time. And people I know, for example, who have devoted their sort of lives in Israel or their activism to reconciliation, to encounter, to sort of moving towards a solution, um, that even when it's not possible to move to a sort of full political settlement, it's possible to move in a better or a worse direction. And I think that hopefully people can continue to move in a better direction and not a worse direction, even though that's not the sort of way that it looks right now.
Adam, thank you so much. You've really enlightened us. You've really helped us, I think, in our mission, which is to bring several different viewpoints to these, incredibly difficult, contentious, even and emotional issues, that we're all facing here. Your work is really exceptional, and I'm only just my only regret is that we couldn't do it in person. And maybe some of the color of the questions that were typed very nicely online would have come across a little bit differently and maybe a little bit more organically. But next time, hopefully we can have you on campus when there's some less snow on the ground and conditions improve. But thank you so much, Adam, for your time,
Thank
and
you.
we look forward to staying in touch.
Thanks so much, and thanks everyone.
All the best.